The bus was 20 minutes late, and the 80-year-old veteran was getting soaked in the evening rain. But he waited patiently because walking the 3 miles home wasn't an option anymore. When 4 high school dropouts decided to use him as a punching bag for their twisted amusement, beating him while calling him a pathetic old loser, it seemed like just another sad story of society's cruelty, until their violence exposed the DEVGRU tattoo on his chest that told a very different story. This wasn't some helpless vagrant, but one of America's most lethal ghosts. The rain fell in steady sheets across downtown Cleveland, turning the evening commute into a miserable slog of honking horns and splashing tires. At the corner of East 9th and Superior, beneath a flickering streetlight that cast uneven shadows on the wet pavement, stood a solitary figure who seemed to embody the city's forgotten souls. William "Ghost" Patterson was 80 years old, though the harsh lines carved into his weathered face made him appear even older. His thin frame was wrapped in a threadbare coat that had seen better decades, his gray hair plastered to his skull by the relentless rain, and his arthritic hands clutched a small paper bag of groceries, with the desperate grip of someone who knew that losing them meant going hungry. He'd been standing at this same bus stop for 23 minutes, watching as the Route 15 bus failed to appear at its scheduled time. Again, the bench was broken, had been for months, so he stood on legs that ached with old shrapnel wounds and joints that protested every movement. But William Patterson had learned patience in places where impatience meant death, so he waited. What the passing pedestrians didn't know was that William Patterson had once been one of the most dangerous men alive. For 26 years, he had served with Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DEVGRU, the unit so classified that most people knew it only as SEAL Team 6. He had conducted over 180 operations across 5 continents, had eliminated high-value targets in places that didn't appear on maps, and had earned the call sign Ghost because of his ability to appear and disappear without leaving any trace of his presence. But that was 40 years ago, in a world that had forgotten him as completely as the government files that still classified most of his service record. Now, William Patterson was just another old man standing in the rain, waiting for a bus that would take him back to a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and loneliness. The grocery bag in his hands contained his weekly provisions: a loaf of marked-down bread, a can of soup, and a small container of peanut butter. Total cost $4.89, his entire food budget until next Tuesday. As he stood there, water dripping from his clothes and pooling at his feet, William noticed movement in his peripheral vision. 4 figures were approaching from across the street, moving with the predatory confidence of young men who had learned that the world rarely held them accountable for their actions. They were teenagers, probably 17 or 18, with the kind of expensive sneakers and designer jackets that spoke of parents who provided everything except supervision. Their leader was tall and lean, with dead eyes and the sort of smile that suggested he enjoyed causing pain. The others followed his lead like a pack of wolves, eager for whatever entertainment their alpha had in mind. William had survived too many dangerous situations to ignore his instincts. These 4 weren't just seeking shelter from the rain, they were hunting, and he was standing alone under a broken streetlight with nowhere to run. "Look what we got here," the tall one said as they approached, his voice carrying over the sound of rainfall. Old man standing in the rain like a scarecrow. William didn't respond. Experience had taught him that engaging with predators only encouraged them. Better to remain invisible, to hope they would find more interesting prey elsewhere. But invisibility was a luxury these 4 weren't going to grant him. "Hey, Grandpa," the tall one called out, stepping closer. "I'm talking to you." William finally looked up, taking in their faces, with the kind of quick assessment that had once kept him alive in hostile territory. 4 teenagers, intoxicated by their own perceived power, looking for someone to hurt. The smart play would be to give them whatever they wanted and hope they'd leave him alone. "Just waiting for the bus," William said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Bus ain't coming, old man," said one of the others, a stocky kid with acne scars and mean eyes. "Been watching you stand here like an idiot for half an hour." "I'll wait," William replied simply. "You'll wait?" The tall leader laughed, and the sound held no warmth. For what? You got somewhere important to be? Some big meeting at the senior center? The others joined in the laughter, emboldened by their leader's cruelty. William clutched his grocery bag closer to his chest. Please, I just want to go home. The word please seemed to flip a switch in the four teenagers. They'd found someone who would beg, someone who was truly afraid, someone they could torment without consequences. Please, the tall one mocked. Did you hear that? Grandpa's begging already. He stepped closer, close enough that William could smell the alcohol on his breath and see the cruelty in his eyes. Tell you what, old man, you want to get on that bus when it comes? You're gonna have to pay a toll. I don't have much money, William said, his voice shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the cold rain that had soaked through his inadequate clothing. Not talking about money, the stocky one said with a grin that revealed crooked teeth. We want entertainment. You're gonna dance for us, Grandpa. Right here in the rain. William looked around desperately, hoping to see other people, police, anyone who might intervene. But the street was empty, except for passing cars whose drivers were too focused on the weather to notice what was happening at the bus stop. I can't dance, William said. Your legs work well enough to stand here taking up space, the tall leader interrupted. Now dance, or we'll give you something worse to worry about than sore joints. William remained motionless, dignity overriding fear. He had faced down terrorists and enemy soldiers, had stared death in the face more times than he could count. He wouldn't demean himself for the amusement of these children. His refusal to comply was apparently the excuse they'd been looking for. The first shove came from behind, sending William stumbling forward into the arms of the tall leader, who pushed him back toward the others like he was a pinball. The grocery bag fell from his hands, its contents scattering across the wet pavement. Oops, laughed the stocky one. Looks like Grandpa's dinner is getting a bath. William bent down to retrieve his groceries, but a boot kicked the bread loaf into a puddle, turning it into soggy mush. Leave it, the tall leader commanded. You got bigger problems than bread. That's when the real violence began. The first punch caught William in the stomach, doubling him over and driving the air from his lungs. Before he could recover, another hit landed on his back, sending him to his knees on the wet pavement. Pathetic old loser, one of them spat. Should have died years ago, added another. Nobody wants you here, laughed a third. They surrounded him like vultures, taking turns throwing punches and kicks while he tried to protect his vital organs. Each impact sent fire through bones that had already endured too much trauma, reopening wounds that had never properly healed. William curled up on the cold concrete, trying to make himself small, trying to endure until they lost interest. But the beating continued with the methodical cruelty of people who had discovered they enjoyed causing pain. And then, in their enthusiasm to inflict maximum damage, one of the attackers grabbed William's coat to haul him upright for better access to his face. The fabric, already weakened by years of wear and the violence it had just endured, couldn't take the additional stress. The coat tore with a sound like a thunderclap, ripping wide across the chest and exposing William's weathered torso to the cold rain and the streetlight's harsh glare. And there, etched deep into the scarred skin over his heart, was a tattoo that made the world suddenly stop turning. It wasn't the usual military ink that the teenagers might have expected from an old veteran. No eagles or flags or motivational slogans. This was something far more specific, far more deadly. The DEVGRU emblem. A skull and crossbones, with a trident, surrounded by the kind of classified markings that most people weren't supposed to know existed, and underneath it, in letters that had been burned into flesh during a secret ceremony 40 years ago, Ghost, never detected, never captured. The four teenagers stared at the tattoo without understanding what they were seeing. But someone else on that rain-soaked street corner understood perfectly. Officer Maria Santos had been a Cleveland PD patrol officer for 12 years. She'd served 4 years in the Marine Corps before joining the police force, and she'd worked with enough special operations personnel to recognize the significance of what she was witnessing through her squad car windshield. She'd been driving her regular patrol route when she spotted the commotion at the bus stop, At first glance, it looked like typical urban violence, some kids beating up a homeless man. She'd seen it before, would probably see it again. But as she slowed her cruiser to investigate, the torn jacket and exposed tattoo made her slam on the brakes so hard that her coffee spilled across the dashboard. DEVGRU, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The most classified, most lethal unit in the American military. The same unit that had eliminated Osama bin Laden, that conducted operations so secret that their existence was barely acknowledged even in Pentagon briefings. Officer Santos threw her cruiser into park and erupted from the driver's seat like a woman possessed. "Cleveland PD, get away from him right now." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to command in life-or-death situations, and it cut through the rain-soaked night like a blade. The 4 teenagers looked up, startled by the interruption. The tall leader still had his hands on William's torn coat, the DEVGRU tattoo fully visible in the streetlight's glare. "Just having some fun with the old bum," the stocky one said, but his bravado was already faltering. Officer Santos approached with her hand resting on her service weapon, her eyes never leaving the exposed tattoo. "Step back," she commanded. "All of you. Hands where I can see them." As the teenagers reluctantly complied, Santos knelt beside William, who was struggling to pull his torn coat back together. "Sir," she said quietly, "are you injured?" William looked up at her with eyes that held decades of pain and dignity. "I'll be all right, officer." "Sir, what's your name?" "William Patterson." Santos felt her breath catch. She'd heard that name before, whispered in the kind of military circles where legends were discussed in hushed tones. "Master Chief Patterson?" she asked. "DEVGRU." William nodded slightly, surprised that a local police officer would know his rank and unit. "Sir, I'm Officer Santos, Marine Corps veteran. It's an honor to meet you." She stood up and faced the 4 teenagers, who were beginning to understand that they'd stumbled into something far bigger than they'd anticipated. "Do you 4 have any idea what you just did?" Santos asked, her voice deadly quiet. "We were just messing around," the tall leader said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "You were just messing around," Santos repeated, "with a DEVGRU operator. Do you know what that means?" The teenagers looked at each other with growing confusion and fear. "That stands for Naval Special Warfare Development Group," Santos continued. "SEAL Team 6, the unit that killed bin Laden, the most elite warriors in the American military." The effect was immediate and devastating. The 4 teenagers stepped back from William as if he had suddenly become radioactive. "That's impossible," the stocky one whispered. "He's just some old homeless guy." "Look at him again," Santos commanded. "Look at his posture. Look at his scars. Look at the way he carries himself even after you beat him down. That's not some homeless guy. That's a man who has eliminated more enemies than you have, brain cell." She was already reaching for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need backup at East 9th and Superior. I have 4 suspects in custody for assault on a federal military veteran." "Wait," the tall leader said quickly. "We didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care," Santos interrupted. "You saw an old man standing in the rain and decided he was fair game for your entertainment. You never once considered that he might be someone deserving of respect." As backup units began arriving, their red and blue lights cutting through the rain and darkness, other patrol officers emerged to secure the scene. When they saw the DEVGRU tattoo on William's chest, their demeanor shifted from routine procedure to something approaching reverence. Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of the force, approached William with obvious respect. "Sir, I want to apologize on behalf of the city," he said. "What happened here tonight is inexcusable." "Thank you, Sergeant," William replied quietly. "But these boys didn't know who I was. They just saw someone they thought was weak." "That doesn't excuse what they did," Officer Santos said firmly. "Assault is assault, regardless of who the victim is." As the 4 teenagers were loaded into patrol cars, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. William gathered his scattered groceries from the wet pavement. Most of the food was ruined, but he collected what he could with the careful movements of someone accustomed to making do with less. "Sir," Officer Santos said, "let me drive you home, and we'll make sure your groceries are replaced." "That's not necessary," William protested. "Yes, it is," she said firmly. "It's the least we can do." As they drove through the rain-soaked streets of Cleveland, Santos found herself thinking about the stories she'd heard during her military service. Tales of DEVGRU operators who conducted missions so classified that their families never knew where they'd been or what they'd done. Men who had sacrificed everything for their country and asked for nothing in return. "Sir, can I ask you something?" she said as they pulled up to William's apartment building. "Of course. How did you end up in this situation?" William was quiet for a moment. Classified service doesn't translate well to civilian job applications. When your entire career is top secret, it's hard to prove you actually did anything. "I worked construction for a while, but when you get older, employers don't want you. Social Security helps, but not enough." The simple explanation carried the weight of a system that had failed one of its heroes. "That's going to change," Santos said with conviction, "starting tonight." Over the following weeks, word of what had happened at the bus stop spread through the Cleveland Police Department and beyond. William Patterson became something of a local legend, not because people wanted to gawk at him, but because his story served as a powerful reminder about the dangers of judging people by their appearance. The four teenagers faced serious charges. During their arraignment, the judge made it clear that assaulting a decorated veteran carried additional penalties under federal law. But perhaps more importantly, the incident forced each of them to confront what they had become. The tall leader, whose name was Brandon Walsh, found himself assigned to community service at a local veterans shelter. What started as court-ordered punishment became something transformative as he listened to stories from men and women who had served their country with honor and dignity. Officer Santos made good on her promise to ensure William's situation improved. She connected him with veterans services he hadn't known existed, helped him apply for benefits he'd never claimed, and introduced him to a community of people who understood the true value of his service. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how the neighborhood around William's bus stop began to treat him. Word had spread about the quiet old man who turned out to be a decorated SEAL, and people started seeing him differently, not as someone to be pitied or avoided, but as someone to be respected and protected. Mrs. Chen, who owned the corner grocery store, began setting aside day-old items for William at no charge. "For our protector," she would say with a bow that spoke of genuine gratitude. The bus drivers on Route 15 started keeping an eye out for William, making sure he never waited in the rain again. Some even went out of their way to check on him if they didn't see him at his usual stop. A local veterans organization heard about his story and presented him with a proper winter coat. Not charity, they insisted, but recognition of his service. 3 months after the incident, William received an unexpected visitor at his apartment. A young man in civilian clothes stood at his door, but his bearing immediately identified him as military. "Master Chief Patterson, I'm Petty Officer Rodriguez, currently assigned to DEVGRU. I wanted to meet you." William stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. "How did—" "Word gets around when one of our own makes the news," Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "Mind if I come in?" William's small apartment was spartanly furnished but meticulously clean, everything in its proper place. Rodriguez looked around with the quick assessment of a professional, but his expression showed only respect. "Sir, the team wanted me to check on you," Rodriguez said. "We heard about what happened, and we wanted to make sure you're being taken care of." "I'm fine," William said automatically, the response of someone who had spent decades handling problems alone. "With respect, sir." "No, you're not," Rodriguez said gently. "We did some checking. You're living on barely enough to survive, dealing with medical issues related to your service, and until recently, you were facing all of this completely alone." He pulled out an envelope. "The team has established a fund for operators who might be falling through the cracks. This isn't charity. It's family taking care of family." William looked at the envelope without opening it, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't need to do this," he said. "Yes, we do," Rodriguez replied firmly. You set the standards we still follow today. Your operations in the 80s and 90s established protocols that we use in current missions. You may have thought you were forgotten, but your legacy lives on in every successful operation we complete. That evening, as Rodriguez prepared to leave, he had one more thing to share. Sir, there's going to be a reunion ceremony next month. Active and retired DEVGRU personnel. We'd like you to be our guest of honor. William was quiet for a long moment. I don't know if I'm up for that kind of attention. Sir, it's not about attention. It's about recognition. It's about making sure the current generation understands the foundation you and your teammates built for them. 6 weeks later, William Patterson stood before an assembly of America's most elite warriors, wearing a new suit provided by the DEVGRU Association. When he was introduced to speak, the entire room stood in recognition. Men who rarely showed emotion, who had been trained to compartmentalize feelings and focus on missions. Gentlemen, William began, his voice stronger than it had been in years. When I retired 30 years ago, I thought my service to this country was over. I thought I would fade into the background and eventually be forgotten. His voice carried clearly through the room. But I learned something important recently. Our service doesn't end when we hang up the uniform. Our brotherhood doesn't end when we transition to civilian life. And our responsibility to each other doesn't end just because we're no longer active. He looked out at faces connected by shared sacrifice and purpose. Every man in this room has given something significant for his country. Some have given years of their lives, some pieces of their bodies, some parts of their souls. But we continue to serve in different ways, as fathers, as mentors, as examples of what honor looks like. The room remained perfectly silent. But sometimes we need help. Sometimes the battles we fight at home are harder than the ones we fought overseas. Sometimes we need our brothers to remind us that we're not forgotten, that we still matter, that our sacrifices still have value. His voice became more personal. 3 months ago, I was beaten by 4 teenagers at a bus stop because I looked like someone who didn't matter. But that moment led to something better. It reminded me that I'm part of something larger than myself, that my story is connected to your stories, that none of us has to face our battles alone. After the ceremony, William was surrounded by SEALs wanting to share their own stories, to make connections, to ensure he knew he was valued and remembered. But the conversation that meant the most came from a young petty officer who had been part of recent counterterrorism operations. Sir, the young man said, I wanted you to know that before every high-risk mission, we study after-action reports from operations like yours. Your techniques for deep reconnaissance and target elimination are still part of our training curriculum. You may have thought you were forgotten, but your legacy lives on in every mission we complete successfully. William felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with his old wounds and everything to do with the recognition that his life had mattered, that his service had value beyond the classified files. The 4 teenagers who had attacked him that rainy night also attended the ceremony, not as participants, but as observers, invited by the judge who had sentenced them to learn about the man they had assaulted. They sat in the back, barely speaking, absorbing the full magnitude of what they had done. Brandon Walsh, the former ringleader, approached William afterward with obvious nervousness. Sir, I don't expect you to forgive me, he said quietly, but I wanted you to know that I'm not the same person who hurt you that night. Working at the veteran shelter has taught me things about honor and sacrifice that I never understood before. William looked at him for a long moment. What have you learned, son? That heroes don't always look heroic, that the strongest people are often the quietest, and that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn through service to others. William nodded approvingly. Those are good lessons. Hard ones, but good ones. A year later, William Patterson received a letter that would change his life once more. The Department of Veterans Affairs, prompted by the attention his story had received, conducted a review of his service record. They discovered that he had never received several decorations he had earned, and that his disability rating had been incorrectly calculated. The back pay and increased benefits meant he could afford proper housing, regular medical care, and the kind of dignity that all veterans deserved, but perhaps more importantly, he was invited to speak at military academies and veterans organizations about the importance of looking out for one another. "Every veteran you meet is fighting battles you can't see," he would tell audiences. "Your job isn't to identify who's a hero and who isn't. Your job is to treat everyone like they might be, because often they are." When William Patterson passed away peacefully 5 years later, his funeral was attended by over 500 people. DEVGRU operators served as pallbearers. The mayor spoke about how one man's story had changed an entire city's approach to veteran services, and the 4 former teenagers who had attacked him stood together, now adults who had dedicated their lives to helping others. The inscription on his headstone, chosen by the DEVGRU community, read simply, "Master Chief William Ghost Patterson. He taught us that heroes walk among us every day, often unnoticed and unappreciated, carrying their burdens in silence while asking for nothing more than basic human dignity." The DEVGRU tattoo that had shocked a rainy street corner had become a symbol of something larger, the recognition that service comes in many forms, that sacrifice is often invisible, and that the strongest among us are frequently those who suffer in silence. In Cleveland, at the corner of East 9th and Superior, a small plaque now marks the bus stop where William Patterson waited in the rain. It doesn't tell the whole story, that would take volumes, but it serves as a reminder that every person waiting for a bus, sitting on a bench, or walking down the street has a story worth knowing. And sometimes, if we're wise enough to look beyond appearances and brave enough to ask the right questions, we discover that the person we're overlooking might be the person who once stood between us and those who would do us harm. The rain still falls on that corner, but now people wait differently. They look at each other with more curiosity and less judgment. They offer help without being asked. They remember that dignity is not something you earn through appearance or wealth, but something you're born with, and that others have the power to either respect or destroy. William Ghost Patterson completed his final mission not with weapons or stealth, but with the simple power of a story that reminded an entire city about the importance of seeing the humanity in everyone. And in a world that too often forgets its heroes, that might have been the most important operation of all.